Today, I would like to talk about grief and loss. I can start with a little bit of my story. Until the age of 13, 14, I didn't think nothing about death. It was something that was not, um, I didn't experience the death of anybody near me. I didn't go to funerals before that age. Um, Nothing. It didn't affect me at all. It wasn't. It wasn't in. It wasn't in my awareness. Then, when I was 14, my mother died after being ill for months, being in hospital for months, and for me it was very hard because she was my favorite person, and to see her health getting worse, and her being in a hospital and being I would imagine her coming back home and things going back to as they were before. Um, but with time, that was more and more difficult. And in the end, I couldn't imagine it anymore because I seen all the feedback from the hospital that in the end, in the last few days of her life, I was supposed to go on a school trip, and my family told me not to go because the hospital staff said that she may die when I was out on a trip. So I did stay home, and she died. I think the week following that trip I didn't go to, and for me it was a shock because I didn't like my new life in the sense that um, I had to go and live with my grandparents instead of living with my mom like I did all my life. It was a big change, and yeah, it was my family, it was people I knew, but not so well. It was new dynamics, new city, new school, everything new, and I was in a state of being really numb and being like, uh, and even being unsure that she was gone because I didn't want to go and see the body. And some people in my family told me you should do it because like it gave us comfort to see some kind of comfort, some kind of closure to see the body after she died, and I didn't want to do that, but I still had this doubts sometimes, is she dead or not, because I didn't see the body, so I didn't have this confirmation, visual confirmation of it, let's say. And then so the years after that were pretty hard to um, and really I was in a state where I was a little bit I didn't really have much drive. I was good in school, and when my mom was ill and after she died, I was less good. Like I wasn't, I didn't care much about school. It was difficult for me to have the good grades for a while, and um, and then little by little things started to kind of get better. And then my aunt died very suddenly, and that was she committed suicide, and that was a shock. Um, and so it was like when things started to look like they were going kind of well again. something else happened. Someone else died. And I remember having a dream after she died, and after some time after she died. And in the dream, she was in the flat where we were living, and we were living in the same flat with my grandparents and my other aunt. And she was there, and there was other people, and I would be kind of scared to see her because I knew that she was dead and she wasn't supposed to be there. And she was really just calm. She was just there. She wasn't doing anything in particular in my dream, but I just woke up from the dream in a kind of in a panic because my feeling was she was not supposed to there. She was not supposed to be there, and so that was really my awareness of death at the time, was that I didn't know what happened to people when they die. I had, especially my grandma, who was Catholic, and I had some kind of, I went to Catholic Mass for for a few years because I was in the Catholic Scouts. So we would go to the Mass on Sundays, and so my exposure to the Catholic religion was some Mass, some teaching in the Scouts, some material we had to read, because before that, like in Italy, in schools, children families can decide not to have a religious education, and my mom decided that I wouldn't have it. Her view was that she was raised Catholic, and then she was kind of a rebel, and then she decided she was atheist. She didn't have any religion, and then eventually, when I was about, I think, 9 years old, she converted to Buddhism. She was in the what is now the SGI, that is kind of Japanese Buddhism, and and um, and so I was just observing her, and I was not going to the religion classes, and I was not exposed to those catechism and those kind of religion teachings. And what she told me was, I'm not going to baptize you Catholic. I want you to choose your own religion. And she did the same. Like, she was baptized. She had all the kind of sacraments of the Catholic. There's one like there's one in primary school, there's one in secondary school, and then there's the marriage. After that, she didn't do that. The marriage in the church. Yeah, she converted before that. And actually, we did see a Buddhist marriage, a Buddhist wedding. We did go to it. It was interesting. It was nice. And Buddhism really, really helped her to change things she wanted to change in her life. It was really like a good spiritual practice for her. So it did help her to really change some aspects of her life she wanted to change. And so I was about 17, 18 when I had this people around me who died. That was my mom, and as my aunt, and then my father died in around that time as well. And my father was different because I didn't know him. So what happened is that, and I think it was some kind of protection from my mom, that they split when I was probably around 1, 2 years old. And the last time I seen him, I was 5, and I remember just this kind of image of a person looking at me and saying hi, and that probably my dad. And actually, he never took care of me, never, like there was no contact. And now knowing the kind of life he had, I think that the fact that he was completely out of my life was very good for me. In the sense, it was like a rejection is protection. I was kind of protected from seeing the things that happened in his life, and and it's a kind of protection from my mom of really uh, not knowing much about him, and not being exposed when I was small to to his life. And but what happened when I was a teenager is that because there was some kind of legal papers to sign after he died, and there was no contact with his family neither. Some kind of lawyer called saying that I had to go and sign some papers because I had some kind of inheritance, some kind of inheritance from him. So I found this is how I found out he died from some kind of lawyer, because really there was no contact with the whole family, that whole part of the family. And so I remember that day that when I found out that he was dead, I just closed myself in the bathroom, and I cried a little bit. That was my mourning my father that I didn't know. And I have only a couple of pictures of him, and yeah, at that time that was it. And my view of what happens after the afterlife was, in a sense, was, I don't know if it was because I was a teenager. It was like there's nothing, there's nothing, uh, just everything black, nothing finished. Life is finished, everything like that. So that was very bad for me. That was bad. It didn't give me any comfort to think that my mom was just gone forever, that my aunt was just gone forever, and things like that. But I didn't believe either that there would be a heaven or a hell, depending on how you behave in life. And so yeah, I kind of wanted to find out. And the other thing was that Buddhism talks about reincarnation, and I was kind of jealous of that, in the sense I didn't really wanted my mom to go on with in another life with other people and leave me there on my own, like this, like it she's my mom. I don't want her to go on and live somewhere else. So there was that. That probably was from my trauma, I was kind of clingy to her because carer. Um, she was the person who was taking care of me. And and after that, a few years went by, and I had my children. And actually, before to have my children, my grandma died. And and I do like to read, and I do like to study. So probably there was something in the back of my mind of thinking of trying to solve this, um, this mystery, like to understand what happens after we die. Um, and yeah, I didn't have this. I really had this hole in my heart of my mom that was gone, um, and these other people who died around me. So um, so comes I think it was 2013. My grandma was actually before that. My aunt died, and my aunt was my favorite person after my mom. Was my other favorite person. She was the youngest. There were four sisters. She was the youngest sister, so she was kind of, in a sense, she was a big sister for me. And she was a little bit like a mom as well, because we were living together after my mom died. We were living with my grandparents, and we were sharing a room. So she was like a sister mother. She was mothering me sometimes, and sometimes she was more like a friend, like a teacher. We would use the same clothes, share clothes, and stuff like that. And she fell ill, and um, and she died. And when she was ill, I went to see her, and I was so desperate. I was really when I knew that she was terminal. Uh, I just traveled from UK to Italy, where she was, and I was crying the whole way. I had another aunt told me stop crying, don't enter there crying. But I was a mess, because I was already thinking that she was going to die. And um and I'm happy that I changed my mindset, and I changed like my emotional things lately, because really Queen, we are not supporting the ill at all, the people who are ill at all. When we show up like that, we show up desperate. And well, I can't change that. I can't go back, and I'm okay with it now, because of the things that happen later. um but yeah, yeah, that's how my life was. I was in fear. I was a lot in fear, and so that showed up with me not being really supportive. When I went to see her, I was like crying and being desperate. And but yeah, I did stay with her. Like, I went with her. She had some kind of surgery, and I went to that trip with her when she had the surgery. So kind of try to support her in that way. And then yeah, when she died, I was a mess again. I was like, and she was like, my mom and my aunt, they were both like angels. My mom was super generous, even though she didn't have much money. Um, but I remember her helping a family who were squatting in a house. They didn't, like, they were homeless. The whole family, I think they had one or two children, and they were living in houses that were they were living in a flat that was kind of abandoned. There were houses that were supposed to be destroyed to build something else. So it was just like, it looked like a war zone, because those houses were not used anymore, and these people were so poor they couldn't pay rent, and she was helping them. She was probably bringing them food or something. I remember that. And then I remember her helping someone who was kind of starving. and she took some food and she gave it to them. So I really seen these acts of really big generosity, and she didn't have much. She didn't have much. She wasn't like here 100 pounds. No, she was taking from her own money. Like she had she didn't have much money. And my aunt was similar, but kind of different. She was more of an angel in the sense that she would help the whole family. So actually, yeah, my grandma, when she died, my grandma went into a depression because she was really helping her, and she was helping everybody in the family from when she was small. She was a kid. For example, when my aunt, when my other aunt committed suicide, she decided to redecorate her room and to keep it open because my grandpa straight away started to close that door with a key, to say, okay, let's close this door. Let's, like, that person who lived in that room is gone. Let's close the door. And she said, no, we cannot do this. Let's open it. Let's redecorate, and let's live on. Um, let's go through this. So she was really helping other people in the family. And then, as I seen with many women around me, my grandma as well, probably one of the things that got her to become ill was that she wasn't taking care of others before to take care of herself. So, so that can bring disease. Um, but yeah, she was super loving, and so for me, it was like when she died, I was like crying a lot, and when she had her surgery, because it was very, she was in ICU. I think she was not conscious after the surgery for a while. I was just crying all the time there. And it was different with my mom, because with my mom I couldn't cry. When I was 14, I was just stunned. I was like, this is not possible. What am I going to do now? This is like the person that I thought would be in my life all the time, and she's gone. What happens now? So yeah, I was really a few years like this, and then it was always in the background because then other things happen. I go to universities, jobs, and relationships, and life, friends, and there's happy moments as well. And so sometimes it just goes in the background, but if there is something that is not kind of processed, it just stays there and eventually comes back up. And so 2013, I go to see my grandma, and she was ill at that time, and she had a cancer, and the week where I was on holiday is the week she died. And I was helping her. It was interesting in a sense because there was my cousin and my aunt um, who were helping her, and they were telling me, so they were seeing her every day, and then I came for a few days for the holidays, and they told me, and so I was helping her, and like preparing food for her, taking care of her, and and she started to get better, to have more appetite and things like that. And talking with my aunt and my cousin who knew her situation, who knew her condition and everything, and they knew what happened with other her sisters, and other people same age as her. They say, that happens sometime when people are dying, that they suddenly get better and then they die, something like that. Yeah, and that's what happened. After that, she was in a lot of pain and she was screaming. So we called the doctor, and I don't know if the doctor was there, but I'm unsure. So there was this moment that for me it was beautiful. She had a vision, like the moment when she died, she had a vision. She stopped screaming for pain, and she was calm, and she had a wonder in her eyes, and she looked at the end of the bed. She was on her bed. She looked at the end of her bed, and she nodded 3 times. And almost in real time, there was me, there was my aunt, there was my cousin, and there was my grandpa in the room, I think. And we kind of seen the first nod. She's seeing my mom. Second nod, she's seeing my aunt. Third nod, she's seeing the other aunt. She's seeing the three daughters who died before her. They came for her. They came to collect her. And she was like that. And then after that, I was holding her hand, and she let go of my hand. And my aunt told me, go out," to me and my cousin, who we were like the youngest there. Because my aunt told me this thing as well. She said, dying, there's some people that are very close to them. They don't want to die with them. They don't want them to see them die, something like that. So like that for my aunt was an indication that my grandma didn't want me there the moment she was dying. So I went out with my cousin, and she died. But like for me, um, that was beautiful, because to see that her pain was gone and that she died peacefully, and that actually being a Catholic and being having all the life she had, where um, she had to see her children die before her. Um, it's I think she saw she had a hard life, and that she was lucky, and that she was punished by God or something. Um, so she had this big fear of dying, that actually she had lots of different diseases, and she overcame most of them. She overcame a lot, and she had this strength of overcoming the disease and then continue to live for another few years, even though like it happened in the past that she was almost dying, and but she didn't die then. She died a few years later. So, so I think part of it was her big fear of dying. So she wanted to keep alive, even if she was miserable and she didn't enjoy her life much. So I think that seeing this, that she had that vision, and that she found peace at the end, and that she let go of all that fear, and the pain and the fear was gone, and she was like, okay, this is dying. It's it's peaceful. Uh, it's not what I thought it was. And an interesting thing that happened just after she died, a few days after that, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. So I thought it was like a nice flow one soul is going away and one soul is coming in. And the same happened a couple of years after that. When my grandpa died, I found out I was pregnant with my second child. So really there was this synchronicity of two people in my family passing away, and two people coming in, two new souls. And this thing of the vision that my grandma had, it's very interesting because I've listened to Christina Rasmussen. So Christina Rasmussen did a podcast, and in one of the episodes, she talks about the visions of the dying. So when I listened to that episode, I thought, oh, yeah, this is what happened with my grandma. And so there's a study, there's really scientific studies on the visions of the dying, and it happens very often that people who are dying have visions similar to what I just said happened with my grandma. So then, so 2016, I was starting really having my children small. I was really starting to dig into lots of things, reading kind of more spiritual books, and finding out about lots of topics. And one thing I seen at that time was a documentary called The Sacred Science. And I can show you this. So I started a diary at the time, and I started it with writing what was said in the documentary. And so there's a shaman. The scene in the documentary is beautiful. It's you can see, I think it's the Amazon River, and there's someone on a canoe on the river. There's a person. It's very calm, and it says, "What is death? What is life? Life without death has no meaning. Life does not exist without death. Wherever there is life, there is death, and we cannot hide from it. Death is a change, a process. It is necessary for life." Western societies have demonized death. But why? Due to fear and ignorance. Because there's something to be afraid of after death. What is it? It is God. They are truly afraid of God, and He is life itself. So they stay away from death, and by doing so, they stay away from life as well. So I started to think about what is death and things like that. And that was 2016. Then in 2018, I went to an event of art. I started to do my art, like similar to this artworks you see behind me. Around, so after having my children, I started to experiment with it, and then it started to get bigger and bigger. And there is this red boat that was here in this town, and it was like a center for art. So there was an event with an artist, and it was like a women's circle. So it was art, but it was like some kind of, I don't know, women's circle, in which we were asked to bring an object, and I took something that belonged to my mom, and actually was something that was very dear to her because it was the kind of wallet in which she had her book for her Buddhism, to read, to chant. So I really kept that well, and I went there with this wallet from my mom, kind of wallet container, don't know. And we were given 2 minutes, I think, to talk about this object and the person um, related to this object. And the circle started, and a couple of women before me started crying, and they were at the same time they were telling the story. Then when it was my turn, I just cried. I just cried. I just said this belonged to my mom, and then I had like 2 minutes. I cried the whole 2 minutes, and it's something that didn't really happen before. Like for my mom, I didn't cry at the funeral. I didn't at all, and so there was the, kind of this release at that time. And then after that, the following year, um, I came across the book Where Did You Go by Christina Rasmussen. And I have an episode of the podcast with Christina, so you can have a look at that. And um, I think it's a fantastic, fantastic conversation, and it can really give what she says, can really give some answers to people, and you can look at her podcast and look at her books. Fantastic, fantastic content. And for me, what happened is that actually in those years, because I was always a little bit open to fantastic, the science fiction, fantasy books, and dreams and things like that. And from 2017, I started to do the PSYCH-K courses, and is kind of, it is about the subconscious mind, and it is about energy. I was kind of more aware of energy, and I looked into lucid dreaming, so really paying attention to my dreams. And then sometimes in my dreams, there are people coming. Like I had a dream with my aunt, like my favorite aunt. She was, she gave me a gift and and a letter. And I remember, because I did know I was in the dream, I didn't have much time. I was, should I open the gift or should I read the letter? And I started reading the letter and trying to remember it. But when I woke up, and yeah, that was one of the dreams I had with her. Well, it was a nice one. So yeah, sometimes we do find them in dreams. Like, so there is a little bit of like, I do believe in this magic and this unknown, this science and everything. And with the book Where Did You Go? It started with looking at a podcast in which Christina was doing an exercise, and she was kind of guiding a little bit on the steps of the temple journeys she teaches in the book. They are kind of self-guided meditations, and I seen my mom in that first. I just followed her exercise during this podcast. I closed my eyes, followed the steps, and she was guiding us to a door, just to a door, to open the door and to look what's behind the door, something like that. And for me, what happened the first time is that a child hand took my hand and pulled me inside the door, and inside it was like a forest with lots of green leaves. And then I seen an image of my mom. I was blown away by this, so I bought the book and I started to do the temple journeys. I started to read the book, and so the book is called "Where Did You Go?" and it's about really it was Christina's own quest to understand where her husband went, because he died. He died a few years ago when her children were small, and their children were small. So really, she did this template, these self-guided meditations, in which, for me personally, I had so many visions, and it gave me so much healing around my perception of what's on the other side, and what happened with my loved ones. That for me, for example, and I reevaluated all my beliefs around them, because, for example, the fact that they were ill, and or they were like in a situation where economically it wasn't good, there was not much money, and bad relationships and things like that. There was I thought there was some kind of punishment, in that kind of life. There was like, or a less important life. There's someone else who can be successful and um, have like more of a important job and things like that. But actually seeing, having visions of them on the other side, is I realized how beautiful and meaningful their life was, and that in their life I think their soul wanted to learn certain things, and those things, and they did decide to be in those situations to learn those things, and that they are like masters in a sense of, and so a master on the soul level of in real life can look like someone who doesn't have money and doesn't have a nice job, is not famous, and things like that. But actually, on a spiritual level, they are masters. They are like, for example, the way my mom had um, problems with her relationships, and we money and things like that, and how she kind of turned it around and became like a teacher for other people, to help other people with the Buddhism. um, I think that's a beautiful thing she did. Like, she used her experience to help others, um, and so really, like, my, I don't know, my gratitude for them, and my um, admiration for them really grew, um, and even realizing that's not like, when you go after the door, you can it, it's infinite and magic, and it's beautiful. It's so, for example, my aunt, that, like, when she died, like, she was in hospital, and I was desperate like this, when I see her in the temple journeys, where she's like an angel. She has these beautiful white dresses, and she has like a light coming from inside her body, and and she's really completely at peace, and even with her own character, her own personality, kind of bubbly and kind of, goofy, and and yeah, and she helps me. She gives me information. My mom as well. Uh, a beautiful, a beautiful vision I had once was like I had a few of it was like going into pictures, photos I have, uh, and relive those pictures. So there was a picture I took of my mom with her best friend, who is a guy who is very interesting because he was a carpenter, and then he was uh, composing new age music. A very very interesting guy, a very calming, peaceful guy. Like every time we would go and visit him, it was so beautiful for me. I was so happy, and so I remember one of the last times I seen him, I took a picture of both of them, and they were crossed legs on the floor, on the soil in a forest, surrounded by trees. Just my mom and her friend, like that. And in the temple journey, I was in the same scene, but I was tiny. I was like this size. And I would see them as giants in the same situation. Like I would see them sitting there as giants. And it kind of, I understood why, because they were really like masters of what, of their own life in some way. And that moment of them just sitting there in the forest was really a moment of peace, ah, of this is life. And then I had a beautiful one as well. That was because one of the things in doing these temple journeys really helped me um, to overcome some beliefs I had, or some kind of trauma I had that got me staying in a situation where I thought I wasn't worthy or I wasn't loved, something like that. So, and one thing was that my mom, it was a story, and I have no idea if it's completely correct or not. It was that my mom, that I would call my mom, would have called her mom, or mama in Italian. I would call her Lina. That was her name. And so when I asked why, she told me that when I was small, she got impatient. That I was saying, "Mom, Mama," I was crying and saying, "Mom," something like that. And she said, "Stop calling me Mom, call me Lina." So for me, I gave a meaning to that of she is ashamed that I am her daughter, because I think because she was super young. She had me at 17. She was 17 years old when I was born, and so I thought maybe she is ashamed that she's so young and she has a daughter, and and that really was in my subconscious. Even though I had this big love for her and I thought that she loved me a lot and things like that. Um, Deep down, there was that belief of she didn't want a daughter. She was ashamed of having a daughter. She was ashamed of me. So so I had a beautiful temple journey in which I was like a child again, and I was in her hands, and I would feel her love. And I was in her arms, and we were at the seaside, and I would call her mom, and she would hold me, and we would play on the beach. So, so really for me, the temple journeys with these visions were really a way to relieve, rewrite, overwrite these beliefs that were limiting for me. And it's in a beautiful way. It's like watching a movie and living it, watching a movie of myself and living it again and feeling it. So really, it really, really helped me. And with my father as well, because then sometime when I had an intention, when I had something in my mind, for example, an intention of meeting my dad into the temple journey, that happened. So so I could talk with my dad, and that was interesting because the majority of photos I have of him are black and white, and he would be black and white in my visions. um, so actually, yeah, I asked him um, why his absence, why not being around, and he said it was for my spiritual awakening. And yeah, and then in the years I found my own way of connecting with them and communicating and looking at the signs. For example, I associate some animals to people, to my loved ones, and signs. A beautiful thing that happened. So every time I am like in a meditative state or kind of in a flow state, I I can see like around me some signs of them, their presence in some way, and beautiful things that happen. I went to London to do a walking meditation, and I found a shop. The name of the shop is my mom's name. So really, when I was working there during the walking meditations, her name, and that's a shop that the previous time I went to that area, it wasn't there. There was a different shop. so so sometimes there's this beautiful signs, and yeah, it's beautiful. So yeah, and it was beautiful to talk with Christina, and because uh, really, if you would like to know more about where did you go, the book and the meditations, and how it can help you really overcome your grief, um, uh, have a look at that podcast. I think Christina said some beautiful, beautiful things, and she said something like that death doesn't exist for her. That's like um, it's just like going from a room to a bigger room, just like a transition to a bigger room, leaving the body and then going to the bigger room. And with the temple journey, it's like we access to that bigger room, so we have access to our loved ones who passed away, and we can communicate with them. We can create our life as well. And that's the other thing she said. It's very interesting. She said the place where we go to look for our loved ones is the place we go to create. And she said this beautiful thing, for example, that in her own temple journeys, she has this library of all her books that she wrote in different lives. And so when she writes a book, she goes in the temple journey, she adds the book to her library there. So there's like this parallel between this life, this 3D life, and the kind of 5D world that we can see in the temple journeys. And for me, and for Christina, and for other people, that's very visual. We have lots of visions. For some people, they are not able to see with their eyes closed in a sense, but they will feel something in their body instead. And sometimes I do feel something in my body as well. Like it's not the same all the time. Sometimes there's no vision at all. Sometimes I fall asleep. and then for me personally, I had these visions in the temple journeys. I had visions in my meditations. I had very interesting dreams. And I think in a sense that's kind of like, on some level, this is kind of all the same. So yeah, I hope this can be of help to you, and I'm going to link below the things I talked about, especially the book Where Did You Go by Christina Rasmussen, and our episode of the podcast. And yeah, I think that's all, no? Because so yeah, in conclusion, what do I think about, like, for me, in a sense, I'm not scared of death anymore, and I feel like I can approach this topic, and if there is someone who I think, yeah, I'm not scared of death. I think my fear of death is gone, and yeah, I know there may be suffering around that, of course, physical suffering, emotional suffering, but with the tools I have now, I can go out to survival, and then with all the things I've seen, and the messages I had, I'm not afraid for the people who passed away anymore. And I do really believe that it's like our soul never dies, and so when the soul leaves the body, it just goes on to other adventures. And then if we want to keep contact with people who are not in the body anymore, we can. And the temple journeys is a beautiful way because it's like a high vibration one, and in the sense that like it always feels good, and it's always kind of pure, and a beautiful way to connect with them and to connect with ourselves, and create the life we want. Thank you for watching or listening to the Solution Finders. Please like, subscribe, and share so we can inform and inspire more people. If you would like to donate to the podcast, the link is in the description below. All donations go towards paying for software, video editing, and production work. Please visit unamarz.com, unamarz.com, for one-to-one sessions with me to reprogram your subconscious mind, for my original origami art and printed products like t-shirts and stationery, for more info about this podcast. If you've made it till this point, please add your favorite emoji in the comments. Have a wonderful day.